This is a recording to accompany the worksheet on transfer of venue, which is posted on our Twin page. Transfer of venue is movement between one U.S. District Court to another. You get some new terminology when you look at transfer of venue. The court that you originally start in is called the transferor court, and the court that receives the case is called the transferee court. As you see in this diagram, we have a transfer from the Northern District of Ohio to the Central District of Illinois. The court that we originally filed in, the Northern District of Ohio, is called the transferor court, and the court that receives the case, the Central District of Illinois, is called the transferee case. One thing to note about transfer of venue is that the case is not dismissed. The case stays live. It merely moves from one court to another. So this is a depiction of transfer of venue in the federal system. We've got one entity, the federal system, and we see movement between district courts within it in transfer of venue. We're going to talk for a moment about transfer of cases within the state court system. If you're trying to transfer venue within the state court, you need to use the state venue statute. Let's presume, for our purposes, that we're trying to transfer from the Franklin County Common Pleas Court to the Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court. Well, the Ohio State Venue Statutes would tell us when that's permitted. As you can see from both this picture and the one we saw on our previous slide, transfer of venue occurs within the same sovereign entity. So transfer within the federal systems from one federal district court to another occurs within the same sovereign entity, the federal system itself. State venues statutes permit transfer within the sovereign entity of the state. So could we use the state venue statute in Ohio to move from an Ohio Common County Pleas Court to the Southern District of Ohio, the federal system? The answer would be no. This type of transfer is not permitted under the venue statutes because venue only covers transfer within a sovereign entity. We have learned about how you can move between the state courts and the federal courts in the same state when we studied removal under subject matter jurisdiction. But that's really the only way that you know of to move between these state courts and the federal courts. It isn't through transfer of venue. So even though those are movements, make sure you keep those straight in your notes. It's not the same thing. Could we move from the state courts in Ohio to the state courts in Pennsylvania? The answer would be no. Again, transfer of venue occurs within the same sovereign entity, and Ohio and Pennsylvania are two separate sovereigns. We're going to learn a concept coming in the next few classes, forum non-conveniens, which will permit some type of movement, but it's not transfer of venue. It's distinct from that because it requires dismissal of the action. Let's focus on transfer in federal courts. Let's assume we are going to file in the Southern District of Ohio. We'd look for transfer of venue to another district court under the transfer provisions in federal courts, which is 1404 and 1406. So if we wanted to move from the Southern District of Ohio over to the Central District in Illinois, we'd have to comply with either 1404 or 1406. Would 1404 or 1406 permit us to move from the Southern District of Ohio to a state court in Ohio? The answer would be no. Again, transfer of venue has to happen within the same sovereign entity. It's permissible to go between the Southern District of Ohio and the Central District of Illinois because that's the same federal system. But we can't use transfer of venue to move between the federal system in Ohio and the state system in Ohio. Those are separate entities, separate sovereign entities. We did learn a process, a very narrow one, in which you can move between the federal courts in Ohio and the state courts in Ohio, and that was remand. Could we use venue transfer to get to an entirely different system like that in France? The answer would be, again, no. It's a separate sovereign entity. The federal courts and the courts in France are separate sovereigns. Again, forum non will allow us to potentially do this, but it's a separate concept, not transfer of venue. So let's focus on the federal transfer of venue provisions 1404 and 1406. What's the difference? When to use one and when to use the other? Well, it really comes down to whether or not venue was properly laid in the originating transferor court. If it was proper, then you use 1404. If it was improper, then you use 1406. Well, how do you know if venue was properly laid in the transferor court? Well, you'd need to consult the venue statute that says whether or not venue was properly laid in the original court in the transferor court. In our class, we're focusing on 1391. So if you want to know whether or not you need to use 1404 or 1406, you check the original transferor court under 1391 and see whether it was proper. If it was proper, use 1404. If it was improper, use 1406. For our next class, what I want you to do is focus on the table that we have at the end of the worksheet that you have before you now, which compares language in 1404 and 1406. Try and work with that language and see where they're similar and where they're different. We're going to discuss the operations under these two sections, how they operate similarly and how their differences might change their operation. Additionally, I'd like you to compare the cases that you see in your casebook. There's two provided there by the same district court judge, which you have very different opinions. They're very interesting reads, very colorful opinions. What you need to focus on is the standard for transfer of venue and see how it's being applied differently in both cases. Then lastly, I'd like you to focus on the casebook note regarding choice of law. Choice of law is a very complex topic, but one that's very important and has some connection to transfer of venue. We're going to focus on that connection when we get into class. But I'd like you to read that note with care and prepare the questions in the worksheet regarding choice of law.